The Book of Ruth, Part 1. Just setting the scene for Ruth, I want to inform you that today Elizabeth is going to be ruthless in the way she...
Oh, stop it!
You told me that Ruth is full of comedy and puns and jokes, so
Well,
I'm just trying to set the scene. Chapter 1 of Ruth is the story of Ruth and Naomi, primarily. And so the prayer is a prayer that Elizabeth has written on the basis of that part of the story. I invite you to join in the words in bold. Compassionate God, you created us to be in relationship. You made us to be creatures that thrive in community. We hear the story of Ruth and Naomi, where faithful friendship shows the power of love and relationship born out of loss and tragedy. The gift of friendship shared by Naomi and Ruth stands before us as a shining example. With Ruth, Naomi and all those who trust in you.
Okay, I just set a question generally that we'll talk about in the big group, not your small groups. I just wanted to ask people, and for those who've done their homework might like to take a back seat just for the moment, what do you know about the Book of Ruth, or what did you think you knew about the Book of Ruth until you read some of the stuff that I'd sent?
I think it stands as an island of peace, you know.
Oh, dearie me, the jokes just keep coming, don't they? Thank you for that, Bill.
I thought it was written as a response to the Nehemiah edict to get rid of your foreign wives.
Yes, yeah, that's certainly one reason why it was written.
Mm.
Anyone else have any preconceptions about the Book of Ruth, or they were taught something about the Book of Ruth they want to share?
Could I just say, I've always regarded it as a book of filial loyalty and friendship that goes the extra mile. And my older sister is named Ruth, deliberately so by my mother. I guess when Mum was naming my sister, she had that close bond of mother-daughter in mind.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Ian. I mean, that's a fairly traditional view of Ruth, and it's quite widespread, and that's partly true as well.
It's one of the few books that's named for a female name.
Yes, yes, along with Esther. Ruth is the only other book, I think, named for a female name. And, of course, there's Judith in the Apocrypha.
And Susanna.
Susanna in the Apocrypha. So it's not a common thing for the Hebrew Bible to actually name a book after a woman.
Elizabeth, I wholly agree with your introductory comments in the notes. Ruth comes as very welcome relief amidst all the violence and the ethnic cleansing of Judges, Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, which are rather depressing reading because they're so violent.
Yes.
So Ruth is a little sea of calm in between all of that.
Of course, in the Hebrew Bible, that is the Jewish Hebrew Bible, not just the Old Testament, Ruth doesn't actually come there. Ruth is with the writings. But it's been placed in our canon there, and it is, as Bill quoted from my notes, it is a little island of peace and goodwill in a sea of war, treachery, unfaithfulness and violence. It does tell the story of a remarkable woman, a foreign woman who gave up everything to devote herself to her Israelite mother-in-law. But there's more to the book of Ruth. It seems like an idyllic romantic tale, and it's often used as an example of loyalty and obedience and a devout faith. It's often described as naive, charming, sentimental, delightful. As we go through the book of Ruth, you'll find that those adjectives are somewhat misplaced because Ruth actually is nothing of the sort in many ways. Like most of the wisdom literature, Ruth is meticulously crafted. It's got lots of literary devices like irony, double meanings. It's got a real comic element to it, and it has some very striking metaphors. Like the book of Job, it is ambiguous and it's complex. It does have a dark underside, not dark in the way Job is, but this is not often explored outside of scholars of the Old Testament. Ruth was probably written much later than when the story is set. The story is set when the judges ruled, which is around 1225 BCE. It's probably, as I think Kate was saying, no, it wasn't Kate, it was Margaret from Yarralumna was saying. It is written probably as an antidote to the kind of nationalistic fervour that was seen during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. The storyteller seems to be suggesting that Boaz's gracious treatment of a Moabite woman is somewhat unusual, and the book keeps telling you she's a Moabite, and it's telling you that for a reason. It's making sure that you understand it. It keeps repeating Ruth the Moabite. So, and it's an insistence on a rather inclusive attitude to foreigners, and it suggests rather this was written in the 5th century BCE when the issue of intermarriage was a controversial issue. And I've got in your notes, there's 2 quotes, one from Nehemiah and one from Ezra, when it said that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. That is true. It's quoting Deuteronomy, because they did not meet the Israelites with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them. And then in Ezra, we've got described as an abomination the idea that Israelite men took foreign women for themselves and for their sons. So the holy seed was mixed with peoples of the lands. And that's terrible. That's almost Nazism. And in this faithfulness, the officials and leaders have led the way. And then he says in Ezra, when I heard this, I tore my garment, my mantle, and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled. So you've got a really racist kind of tendency, nationalistic racist tendency at work here. And Ruth is probably meant to be a counterpoint to those particular feelings and enactments. So it's composed to remind a nationalistic and post-exilic people who were keen on eliminating foreigners and people of mixed heritage that their most fondly remembered king, that is King David, the great King David, is the great-grandson of a Moabite woman. And while this book might seem to us like a book of peace and goodwill, and in many ways it is, compared to books like Judges, it's too simplistic a view. And I sent you some homework because I thought I am not going to tell you all the answers this week. I am going to see if you can be encouraged to actually look up some of the meaning, because this is actually quite a funny book. So I wanted you to discover the meanings of some of the names in the book of Ruth. Who can tell me what Marlin means? Yes, it does mean
sickness.
Correct.
Why
So
do parents name the child that? I can't understand.
What was that?
Why do parents name their child sickness or infirmity or whatever?
Because they do. It's funny, Henrietta. It's a joke. They don't.
Oh, okay.
I said this book is a comedy, and I'm not kidding. Right. What's Chilean mean?
Spent.
Wasting.
Wasting.
Destruction.
Yep.
Finished. Complete.
So we have sickness and consumption. Now, with names like that, you know they're going to die. So the book starts with 2 blokes, sickness and consumption, and the author is telling you they're doomed. It's meant to be funny. We're not used to finding the Bible funny. This Ruth is actually very funny, especially in this opening chapter. All right, what does Bethlehem mean?
Fertile or house of bread.
House of bread. And what's going on in the house of bread? Why did Naomi and her husband flee from there?
There was a famine.
Yes, we have a famine in the house of bread. That's ironic humour. And where do they flee to?
Moab.
They flee to Moab. And Moab was the race who did what?
Stop the people of Israel getting into Palestine.
Well, they
It
did, and they
didn't offer bread or water.
they
to
didn't
the
offer
people.
bread. That's right. So Naomi and her husband are forced to flee the house of bread because of famine, and they go to the land that no bread was given because there's bread there now. Does that not strike you as ironic humour?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. So sickness and consumption, you know they're going to die. And you've got this ridiculous blooming situation where the house of bread has no bread, and they go to Moab, which is the place that had bread but wouldn't give bread, but's now giving bread. What does Naomi mean?
Pleasant one. Beauty.
Yes,
Beauty.
pleasant one. Pleasant, sweet, or delightful.
Full.
And just for completeness, Orpa means like the back of the neck or the bowing of the neck, which kind of suits what her character does. And Elimelech, who is Naomi's husband, that in Hebrew means my God is king.
Yes.
So it's opened up with all sorts of things that are meant to be quite funny. You've got these ridiculously named young men who you know must be going to die because they're called sickness and consumption, fleeing from the house of bread where there's no bread to the place where there was bread, but they wouldn't give the bread, but there's now bread and they're now having it. And Naomi, it's important to notice that her name means sweet or pleasant because at the end she says, call me Mara. And what does Mara mean?
Bitterness.
Bitterness. So she's adopting an opposite name. Don't call me sweet anymore. Call me Mara, for the Lord has treated me badly. So the opening chapter reveals the author has quite a good sense of humour. And we've got all of these meanings of these names and these plays on words and what they mean to start this ironic kind of comedic story off. And it should be setting the tone for this book, that you're not meant to take it entirely seriously. And maybe it's telling the book with some good humour because it's challenging a nationalistic view that, you know, could get the author into some danger. So by writing it humorously, by making it funny, maybe it will be heard and received better than if it was just a lecture. It's noteworthy too that in keeping with the feminine nature of wisdom, feminine characters actually dominate this book. It's not centred on a man and his son-in-laws, but a woman and her daughters-in-law, and particularly one daughter-in-law. And that is very unusual. And the writer is stressing that familial context. There's descriptive family terms such as daughter-in-law, son, husband, mother-in-law. So it's a very feminine-oriented thing. And the transformation of this unusual family grouping concerns the writer, and they're going to move from all this emptiness, death, and despair that Naomi talks about in the first chapter to fulfillment, life, and hope. And the fact it's got these comic elements kind of indicates that's going to happen. So, and it's unusual. Naomi says things to her daughters-in-law like, go back to the house of your mother. That's really unusual. Normally you'd say, go back to the house of your father, because it's your father that gives you away, as it were, in the ancient world to be married somewhere else. So in her first speech of the book, Naomi counts herself as among the dead. She's lost her husband and sons, and she may as well be dead herself, because how is she going to get on? And in the ancient world, that's a really good question. Widowed women with no children did not fare well. And she sees herself, which is typical of the era, that she's measured solely by her ability to produce sons. And with some irony on the part of the author, and here it comes again, that sense of humour, Naomi recommends her two daughters-in-law find security in her husband's house, forgetting that all of them to date have found neither safety or security in their husbands' houses. In Naomi's worldview, there is no future without a male. She can't provide any more sons for her daughters-in-law to marry, so she is no longer of use. And of course, Naomi is talking about the Levirate law here. When she says, even if I could have a son tonight, a husband tonight, and bear sons, would you wait until they're grown up? That's the Levirate law, where if your husband died and he had a brother, you would be then married to that brother in order to produce an heir for the dead son. So that's what she's referring to there. And she says here, it would know my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me. And there's that word Mara in Hebrew, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. And she's contrasting that with her name, which is sweet, as we've just learned. So Ruth gives an enormously long speech. And it is a really great commitment that Ruth is giving here. To abandon one's ancestral homeland, your family and gods in favour of those of a foreigner in the ancient world was a terribly big risk, and acceptance by any new community was no more means assured, especially when this community has some scripture floating around the place that says Moabites are not to be entered into the assembly of Israel. Just to divert for a minute before we look at Ruth's speech, often this text in chapter 1 has been used to criticise Orpah for returning to her people and gods, and it praises Ruth by comparison. And the story actually never says that, and we shouldn't read that into it. Naomi begs both her daughters to return to their homeland and their own people, and they will probably, in that case, enjoy a greater possibility of home and children. And it is clear that Orpah and Ruth both love their mother-in-law and respect her. So there aren't easy choices here for Ruth or Orpah. Everything means a loss, either with a relationship with Naomi that they'd known for 10 years or with a future with their own people. Now, to the Hebrew reader of the time, Orpah's choice would have been the most sensible, and it's Ruth who would have been seen as problematic. The Hebrew verb that Ruth uses towards Naomi, which is davak, means cling or cleave. It's the same verb used of the relationship to Adam and Eve in Genesis. It was perfectly acceptable for a woman to cleave to a husband and offer to take his people and gods as her people. To a husband, a woman would be expected to cling until death parts us. Yet here Ruth is making this kind of declaration and commitment to another woman, and I think this is some of the author's sense of humour here. It's a completely over-the-top thing that she is doing. Because Naomi's not a husband, and there's no immediate prospect of a husband in sight via Naomi. So this situation is not fitting the norms and is in some ways morally ambiguous, what Ruth is saying. So Ruth is going to return to her homeland with the lowly status of widow and the added complication of a Moabite daughter-in-law to explain away. Racism and nationalism were rampant in ancient times as they have now. Naomi has not managed to dissuade Orpah and Ruth from both returning with her. And it may be she's trying to dissuade them out of concern for herself, not for them. To be burdened with two Moabite women as a widow in the homeland of Israel could have lowered her status even further and stretched her already very small means. So I'm going to ask you a question now. And that question is, what are the clues in the narrative as to what Naomi is really feeling about this wonderful speech of Ruth's? Did she welcome Ruth? Did she blame Moab and the two women for the deaths of her menfolk, as they may have displeased the Lord by taking Moabite wives? Does she want to be rid of Ruth's presence? Does the irony in the first chapter in any ways make some points about this? What do you think? I'm going to pop you in your groups to actually ponder these questions. Welcome back. How did you go with your question? What are the clues in the narrative to what Naomi might really be feeling about Ruth? Did anyone find any?
Yes, silence.
Absolute silence. What else?
Silence.
Yes, there is something else.
They'd already started the journey together, so she's stopping partway through. So she was initially wanting to have the daughters with her.
I think they were just accompanying her for part of the way. Isn't that what the text says?
Yeah.
I don't think it says they're off to Israel with her. They decided to go with her part of the way.
She said she started to return with her daughters-in-law. Yeah, I guess it's not clear.
They went on the way to the land. Doesn't tell us, no.
Elizabeth, can I ask, all the names that they have, Chilean,
Marlon, yeah.
All of those names, are they actual Hebrew names, Or are
No,
they just meant to be stereotypes?
they're not even stereotypes, Ian. They're not stereotypes. A stereotype isn't sickness and consumption.
Like,
It's satire.
It's satire, Ian.
I can't imagine in English anybody calling their child sickness.
You do in a fable though, Ian.
That's right.
Yes.
In a
Yeah, the
fable.
greedy something or the sluggish something or the seven dwarfs with different, you do it in
Yeah,
a
that's right. That's a good analogy,
fable.
Kate. Seven
So,
Story.
Yeah.
taking a Christian book, it's rather like, say, A Pilgrim's Progress,
Yeah.
where all the people, all the characters there are either admired or deprecated qualities.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. But these aren't stereotypes. You don't have a stereotypical person who's sick. Well, not in Ruth. They're meant to be silly names.
Elizabeth, aren't we talking about David's great grandmother here?
Yeah, she doesn't have a silly name, but her husband did.
To poke fun at David's great grandmother would be a bit dicey, wouldn't it?
No, because they're not poking fun at Ruth. We'll get to that. They're poking fun at the name of the husbands. They're actually, the book, all through the book is telling you these husbands cannot survive. And the only reason Ruth can become David's great grandmother is by marrying Boaz. And there's an impediment, and that's a husband. So we have to get rid of him. So we'll call him consumption, and then he's done for. That's the joke, you see.
Feeling a bit
The other thing that Ruth did was she wept. Well, they all wept.
Yes, they did.
So she said, "Don't come with me," and then she wept. So I found that ambiguous.
Well, I think they are genuinely attached to each other. What does Naomi say, though, when Ruth makes this speech? What does the narrator tell you that Naomi feels?
Well, it says she said no more. She couldn't persuade them. And then
No, but what does she say before that, Margaret? What does the narrator say before that?
That Ruth was determined.
Yes, seeing Ruth was determined, Naomi said no more. Those clauses belong together.
yes.
Seeing Ruth was a stubborn, strong-willed, self-determining female,
Yeah.
Naomi shut up because she knew she couldn't change her mind.
She's also a very practical female, because as soon as she arrives, she goes gleaning in the field.
We're not up to that yet, Derek, but yes, she does. She does. We're looking at the moment, we're just looking at whether or not Naomi is welcoming this daughter-in-law being with her, and the answer has to be no.
No.
But if we go back a little bit, Naomi says to her two daughters-in-law back in verse 8, "Go, return each to your mother's house. May the Lord have mercy on you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." We're not told how her daughters-in-laws dealt with their husbands or with Naomi. Maybe they dealt well with Naomi, maybe they didn't. Maybe she has some precedent to think that having Ruth with her is not a bad thing.
I'm inclined to think they probably dealt well, because I think it is fairly clear that they are attached to each other. That's why they've accompanied her, and she's saying to them, look, I can't produce sons for you. Go back to your people. So I'm not sure that's there, but it's questionable. Does Naomi, already an impoverished widow returning to her homeland, want the added encumbrance of a Moabite daughter-in-law that's got no more money than she has?
We also wondered whether Naomi may have not said any more and accepted Ruth's willingness to go with her, not saying any more, may have been pondering what might face them when they arrive back in her homeland, given that she is being accompanied by a Moabite.
Yes.
And Kumar had a very good comment to bring that right into the modern situation, and maybe he might like to share that.
Kumar?
Well, I was thinking this the whole story was the way it's written is very much like present day Sri Lanka, or at least the day I left Sri Lanka maybe 40 years ago. And for a Sinhalese woman to return to her home with the Tamil daughter-in-law, young, pretty, without the husband, was terrible, quite a big price to pay. And the whole street would say, that is the house where the Tamil woman lives. So
Yep.
they would have been marked house in the street. So Naomi was paying a good price, taking Ruth back with her.
Yes. Yeah, I think you've nailed it, Kumar. I think that's what the implication is. Naomi is trying to discourage Ruth from going. So the obedient daughter-in-law here is not Ruth, it's Orpah. Ruth is given this really over-the-top speech, we know from the language that's in it, and Naomi is basically given no choice in the matter. Now, we know the story's going to end happily, but Naomi at this point doesn't. And so she is saddled as a poor widow with a Moabite daughter-in-law. This is probably not going to make things easier for her in her thinking at this point in time.
It's interesting. Neither of these new two daughters-in-law had children apparently.
No, they didn't. That's correct.
Not yet.
How would the families of the daughters react when they turned up after having been married to two Hebrew men? Would they accept them back into their families?
Well, hopefully so. One would hope so. Well, Orpah seems to indicate that would be the case because she does return.
I mean, I wonder whether it wasn't going to be the case for Ruth, that she knew that she was cut off from her rest of her family and they wouldn't have a bar of her.
Well, that's always a possibility, that Ruth decides that she's rather better throwing in her lot with Naomi, and Orpah decides she's better throwing in her lot with her mother's house, as it says. So it's possible, Piers, that you could read that also into the story. But that doesn't mean that Ruth not being able to comfortably fit back into her family doesn't mean that Naomi's jumping out of her skin about Ruth accompanying her. It's clear she's not.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not suggesting that at all.
So, and of course, God is barely mentioned in this story like a lot of the wisdom literature. But you know by the end it's all going to happen well and there's a reason for the whole thing. But at this point in time, everything's up in the air. And Naomi is not saying, well, thank you, Ruth. I am so touched by your speech.
That's
Naomi just says, seeing Ruth, Naomi's thinking, seeing she's determined, I'm going to be quiet. And that is what happens. And there's no further conversation recorded. And we know it's not because the author can't write conversation. We know from the early book the author can write conversation. So Naomi has a final lament. She wants to be known as Mara, which, as I said earlier, means bitterness and the opposite of her own name, meaning sweet. And that suggests that if she's feeling very bitter, her Ruth's exceptional gesture of solidarity and loyalty has not quite registered with Naomi. She laments she returns empty. She doesn't mention the devotion of her daughter-in-law at all. She blames the Lord for her current state of bitterness and emptiness, and she does not see Ruth being with her at this point in time is a blessing. It's also worthy noting at the end of the chapter that Naomi is recognised by the women of Bethlehem, and Ruth has been rendered invisible. The townsfolk and Naomi do not refer to her at all. Now, in ancient times, that's quite significant. Ruth has just been rendered a non-presence. Only the narrator makes reference to Ruth and reminds us that not only is she Ruth the Moabite, but she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. Now, these are one of the great things that make the book of Ruth really interesting. It is not morally clear-cut. This is a story that people often saw as morally clear-cut. No, it's not. The decisions of the characters and their motivations are not straightforward. They're not always what we think they are, and they're not always understood easily. Their motives are ambiguous, as we have seen with Ruth. They're not easily pinned down. The characters have to constantly assess and reassess their decisions in a world where everyone is compromised and limited by the rules and ideologies. And we'll see that more as we progress into the book. In other words, it's a more accurate reflection of life is really like. And the Hebrew Bible, at least the wisdom literature, thrives on this kind of ambiguity and realism. And the text takes, or should take on, a much broader and richer meaning for us because of that. We're going to move now into Ruth chapter 2. So Ruth chapter 1 is intended to challenge your reader or hearer stereotypes about women, loyalties, and national origin by using humour and irony. The relationship of Naomi and Ruth is meant to confront people who are hearing this story about what they thought they knew and invites them to ask new questions that help them begin to rethink the world as it should be. So by this strategy and others that keep the hearer guessing throughout the chapter, the book of Ruth has begun by turning expectations upside down, and it has subverted the dominant world vision of the time. So chapter 2 picks up with Ruth and Naomi nicely settling into life at Bethlehem. And even though Naomi has returned to the house of bread because the Lord has given them food back, the famine has ended, the provision of the Lord was not necessarily going to drop from heaven and provide sustenance to Ruth and her mother-in-law. So the famine that drove Naomi and the family from the house of bread in the first place is not actually going to just automatically supply food. So Ruth proposes she goes and gleans in the field, which is how the very poor in Israel could find a means of surviving. And for Ruth, it is the only means of survival. Gleaning supported beggars, it supported widows and orphans, and that's what it was there for. It was like the welfare system of the time. And up until this point, the story has just been about two widowed women who are supporting each other. However, Ruth gleaning away in the field, and you can see there she is there in a nice picture. She is very industrious and she catches the attention of Boaz. So enter Boaz, owner of the field in which she gleans. He is rich, he is of high standing, and he's far from the lowly status of Naomi and Ruth as you can get. So there she is gleaning in the field, and despite being poor female and a Moabite, Ruth finds favour in the eyes of Boaz, who is rich, male and Jewish. By strange coincidence, Boaz is Naomi's kinsman. And a good translation of his Hebrew name is pillar of the community. As I said, you can't take anyone's name seriously in this book. So on Boaz's appearance, the Hebrew reader is likely to be asking us some serious questions. Why isn't he, as Naomi's kinsman, helping Naomi? Why has he abrogated, apparently, his Israelite familial duty, which dictates he should? Particularly as he is so upright in the community and so obviously rich. Why has she been left to fend for herself, facing deprivation and possible starvation? Why does Boaz only take an interest in Naomi's face after he has sighted Ruth? Will he indeed live up to his name of pillar of society? And at this point, his role is still unclear, though his introduction here raises the possibility he may yet prove of some help to the women. I want you now to go back into your groups and think about the contrast in chapter 2 and have a look at it. What can you find in the first 13 verses? And I suppose you've all read my notes and think you know, but see if you can pick it out from the text. What are the contrasts in chapter 2 and why do you think they are there? Welcome back, everyone. Did you all manage to find lots and lots of contrasts?
Rich and poor.
Yes.
The powerful.
Male and female.
Male and female, yes.
A pillar of Hebrew society and a Moabite woman.
Yes.
Pompous and subversive.
That's a good one, Piers.
Fact and fiction.
Yes, fact and fiction.
Powerful and powerless.
Yes. A bit late. It's up on the screen.
Just control that person, will you, Jenny?
Very difficult.
So why do you think these stereotypes, these opposites are being presented in this?
Because
it's an unlikely result that occurs.
Yes, it's a very unlikely scenario that's happening here at the moment. Margaret, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it's an unexpected outcome.
Yes.
It's unexpected, which
It
is
is quite
what Piers was
unexpected.
saying.
Yeah.
Is it setting the scene for? It's a scene setting.
It is setting the scene. It certainly is. It's gearing up for chapter 3. Because the same thing's going to be happening in chapter 3, but we're going to add a few more things in. Now, one thing you may not have noticed is that there's 2 domains that are operating in Ruth, or 2 worlds. One is the feminine world, which we saw in chapter 1, which was entirely feminine. And now we're in the masculine world in chapter 2. We're in the world of Boaz, a rich man who owns a field that out of the goodness of his heart, he allows the poor to come and glean in it. So we're in the male-dominated world in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we'll go back into the feminine world, and then in chapter 4, we'll be back in the male world. And Ruth is constructed like that quite deliberately. So we're here in the male world, and there's lots of interplays that are quite complex that are going on here. And I have to say that Mr. Pillar of Society is showing an abnormally strong interest in a woman he has clapped eyes on for the first time. And there's all sorts of things Boaz are doing here that you would consider unusual.
Sure. I was going to say, Elizabeth, I thought he was flirting. There was a lot of flirting going on.
Yes, if one can flirt with sheaves of barley, Boaz is certainly doing it. Because and there's a number of things we know that. He sits her down with his workers for lunch and feeds her. He tells them to leave. He tells the reapers to leave extra goodies on the ground for her to find. He gives her extra to take home with her to Naomi. These are all extraordinary things that you would not expect him to do.
He's grooming her.
Here we have Ruth working to resolve the problems that Naomi and her face, and she's gleaning in a field to get food to feed them. And Ruth has also stated at this point that she hopes to find favour in someone's eyes. And this is a very ambiguous statement, again, that Ruth is making. What does it mean to find favour in someone's eyes? When she leaves Naomi, she says, hopefully I'll find favour. Maybe she feels that she's got to ask permission, which is unnecessary under Israelite law. More likely, I think the author is making some subtle inferences here. Finding favour in the Hebrew Bible generally means a woman is desirable in the eyes of men. And we find it in some of the narratives in Genesis, for instance, with patriarchs and their wives. Coupled with a pervasive belief that Moabite women were sexually immoral, and you can check Genesis 19 and Numbers 25, they allude to that. The author is stressing Ruth's vulnerability and also her desirability. So, Boaz. The first thing Boaz says is, to whom does this young woman belong? Which is a fairly irrelevant question as far as his interests as a landowner are concerned. And the author is telling you Boaz is pretty interested. She must be exactly how that picture looks, Derek, because Boaz is reacting to her physical appearance. And the foreman of the field says Ruth is the young Moabite who returned with Naomi. At this point, destiny for Ruth hangs in the balance, because Boaz could just say, right, Moabite, out of my field, because she's a young widow, she's protected by no man, and she has no family except the widowed Naomi. She's completely dependent on Israelite charity. And she's a Moabite to boot. Now, Boaz could further his relationship with Ruth in a number of ways, not all of them pleasant. He is under no obligation to offer this woman an honourable relationship. He could acquire her by force and no one would bat an eyelid in Bethlehem. So Ruth, as I said, her fate is hanging in the balance now. What is Boaz going to do? Well, firstly, he grants Ruth some really, really extraordinary favours, as we said. And I've mentioned what the extraordinary favours are. And they're quite out of the ordinary. He's not offering them to any other gleaners in his field, and he would have other gleaners in his field.
He's also a relative.
Well, he is, but the question is, he has shown no interest whatsoever in helping his relative Naomi till he claps eyes on Ruth. What is that telling you, Patricia?
It's telling me that he's not as bad as we thought he was.
Well, I'm saying it's saying nothing good about him either, because he's been completely uninterested in their fate until he sees Ruth.
Well, she works hard.
She does work hard, but he sees her. He says, who is that woman? He doesn't ask, does she work hard? He has no idea if she works hard. He's older than her. He's obviously not got a Mrs. Boaz hanging around, because he's showing unusual interest in her. And to his discredit, He has shown no interest in his relative Naomi up to this point.
He's just sniffing around.
He certainly is. That's exactly what he's doing.
I give him one mark in that the text says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, as though he was actually a sort of gentleman farmer, didn't arrive from, didn't pay too much attention to what was going on in his fields. He arrived from Bethlehem.
Yep, so he's come out to see what's going on in his fields from Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, not. That's another one of the, I think the author is, having this unusual coincidence. Gwyn.
Why does he make me think of Rupert Murdoch?
Oh.
Actually, by the end of the story, Gwyn, that comparison is going to stack up because Boaz is not what he seems either. But that's chapter 4, so we'll wait till we get to that. We won't ruin the story. Okay, so we have this conversation between Ruth and Boaz, and Ruth, as she did with Naomi, overreacts. She falls prostrate at his feet. Now, you don't generally do that with your fellow human beings in this society. Such deference is reserved usually for God. But Ruth, as I said, is an over-the-top woman. She uses over-the-top phrases when she gave that speech to Naomi, and she's doing it here with Boaz. Ruth asked Boaz a question. She asked, why have I found favour in your sight? And we've seen this phrase has a double meaning. Boaz invokes the name of the Lord here. Apart from her speech in chapter 1, Ruth has shown absolutely no interest in the Lord, the God of Israel. She ignores his reference and again uses that phrase. She repeats it. So the author is really making a point here and uses that phrase about finding favour in your sight in her reply to Boaz. And she addresses him as Lord. And as I said, there's a bit of punning going on here about this phrase and about the name Lord. Ruth makes it clear her fate is going to lie with Boaz, not the God of Israel. And this is emphasised by her saying that Boaz has spoken to her heart. It is not kindly like the NRSV says. And a phrase is frequently used to indicate a love interest. Ruth is signalling her availability and her interest in Boaz because she's on to Boaz. She's not stupid. And she knows when someone's trying to sweep for her and groom her, as Bill said. She has the final say in this conversation, and her words and actions tell Boaz she's not going to be pushed into an inequitable relationship. So she's indicated she's interested, but she's also indicated I'm not just here for you to take me away. So we've got another question here for you. Older commentaries on this book talk of Boaz's moral integrity, and I say humph to that, and Ruth's humility and subservience, and I'm saying humph to that as well. Do you think this chapter is actually highlighting such qualities, or do you think the author is wanting to make a different point? We'll just spend 5 minutes in our rooms having a talk about those questions. Okay, how did you go? What do we think of Boaz and Ruth?
Well, we thought they were both eyeing each other off as to the possibility of some prospect in the future. I think in different ways. She saw him as a husband, but he probably just saw her as a plaything.
Well, he may have initially, yes. And she's certainly eyeing him off as husband material, I think.
I'm intrigued, Elizabeth, that if older commentaries have, as your question puts it, talk of Boaz's moral integrity and Ruth's humility and subservience, we've gone a full circle, well, not a circle, we've done a U-turn here in looking at it in an entirely different way. Is that a reflection of the way we see women now, or is it actually there? Why was it not looked at before in the terms of Ruth being a strong woman with a mind of her own and knowing where her destiny is going to be? Why have we seen it the other way?
Because of what you said initially. It's the way women were seen generally, and that was read into this text.
So it's reading back into the text what people wanted to see rather than looking at what the Hebrew writers were actually saying.
Yes, I think so.
And there's a lot of coded language, isn't there, around powerful men and powerless women. So he says, keep close to my women, I'll stop the young men bothering you. So that can be seen in two ways. It can be seen as kindly, or it can be seen as I'm marking you out for myself.
That's right.
Exactly.
More likely, looking at it now, it's more likely, as Bill said, he's grooming her. So he's doing everything in his power to make sure she gets where he wants her to be.
But I don't think she's not a naive person in this play, though.
No.
No, it's not quite the same as
that's why I'm saying that's how it appears at this point. But we've got more to go in the story yet.
Yes, we do, because the tables are going to be turned on Boaz, and we'll see who's grooming who in chapter 3.
That's right. But taking it where we're at, trying to look
at the
question you asked.
We can't assume that Ruth went to that particular field in order to catch attention, to Boaz's attention. I think she took advantage of the fact that Boaz is showing an interest in her.
I think that's absolutely right, Derek. It's one of those divine coincidences. She just happens to light on Boaz's field, and he just happens to pick that day to come and inspect his field from Bethlehem.
I think it was accidental that she was there. But she's certainly taking advantage of the fact that he is showing an interest in her.
That's right. Oh, no, I'm not questioning that. I think that's right. And of course, this is all going to be reinforced by Naomi.
Well, he's a close relative and he's one of our guardian redeemers.
Because this is what my question is, that when he wants to marry and take over Ruth, he has to go and see the
people at the town gate
responsible for her at the town gate. So maybe it was that person that was supposed to be responsible for them.
Well, we don't know about that person at this stage. You're jumping the gun.
I know.
All we know is what the story tells us, and what the story is telling us is there's a close kinsman of Naomi who could be her redeemer, and he is not. That's all we know.
Yes, as far as the story goes.
As far as the story goes, that's all we know. Now, of course, when Ruth gets home, there's quite a transformation in Naomi. So far, Naomi has spoken 3 words to Ruth, and that is, go, my daughter. When Ruth suggests she'll go and glean, Naomi just says, go, my daughter, nothing else. It's quite a terse response, really. There's no explanation to Ruth. You don't get a sentence saying Naomi explained how this Israelite law worked and where she should go, or the safest field. But now Ruth has arrived home with a truckload, literally, of barley. And Naomi undergoes quite a transformation in relationship to Ruth. Soon as she sees the amount of grain Ruth has gleaned and the fact she has also cooked food that Ruth has given her, something unusual is afoot, and there's got to be a man involved. So her first question is, of course, she wants to know who this bloke is. Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Because Naomi knows the only way Ruth could have that amount of food is if someone took notice of her, and it's got to be a bloke. So Ruth explains to her mother-in-law where she was working, and she says it was in Boaz's field. And Naomi then says, blessed is he, the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So she calls down this blessing on Boaz, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead, in reference to herself and her late husband. And again, a good Hebrew reader would be thinking at this point, it's all very well to bless him now, but where has he been? He has failed to act for Naomi at all before this time. So for the first time, Naomi reveals this familial connection to Boaz, and she calls him a really important Hebrew word, and we're going to meet this word a number of times in Ruth. It's goel, or redeemer. And it indicates a close family member with an assigned role in family legal matters, usually financial. It's to do with things like the inheritance and sale of land and the bondage of family members of slaves if they're in debt, etc. Hebrew laws around land and slavery of family members and debt are quite complex. So to date, Boaz has proved to be a very unreliable goel. And Naomi is very fast here to capitalise on his apparent interest in Ruth. And she says to Ruth the same that Boaz had said, don't go and glean in another field lest she be bothered. That's just code reference to saying there may be some blokes there that'll give you a hard time. And Naomi has shown no interest in Ruth's welfare to date in regard to the risk that she's taken while gleaning. She's not warned her beforehand about making sure to avoid fields where there might be a lot of, you know, rollicking young men.
Hanky-panky.
So I assume here it's self-interest on Naomi's part that's motivating her apparent concern for Ruth. So compared with the Israelite she is in contact with, Ruth the Moabite is looking more virtuous and honourable by the minute. And of course, that is the intention of the author. So Naomi is now showing interest because of her self-interest, and Boaz is showing interest because of his self-interest. And Ruth has a self-interest, but it's bigger than that. It's also about Naomi's welfare as well. So despite being poor, female and a Moabite, Ruth has reversed the normal social order. She's found favour in the eyes of Boaz, who is rich, male and Israelite. And the power relationship between the two is unequal. I think Ruth probably has the jump on him in the intelligence department, and she has subtly taken charge of this situation. And the harvest scenes, of course, if you know anything about the Hebrew Bible, harvest scenes are always about life and fertility and point to blessings to come. But for the moment, life is difficult. Eventually, the harvest will come to the end and more secure provision will need to be made for Ruth and Naomi. More drastic action on Ruth's part will be needed. We're going to end here on this cliffhanger. Next week, we will see what Ruth is going to do to help secure that future. So just to end today, and we'll stay in the big group, what are your impressions about these chapters 1 and 2? And how does that help us think about the world as it should be in terms of foreigners and powerful and not powerful, etc.?
Things don't change, do they?
Well, they don't really. The sad thing is they don't really.
I think things do change a bit. I think that this is a country which has got large numbers of immigrants, which include me, and I think we're being treated much more as full citizens of the country and not as foreigners. Now, I had troubles when I first came, but nothing compared, I must admit, nothing compared, I think, to some other people who came, because I came from England and they came from Greece or Italy. Difficulties of migrants is as great as it was.
You reckon? What about boat people? They're locked up in Melbourne currently.
Well, I think this is terrible. I think there's a very large part of the population who object to them being locked up.
There is, but there's also a sufficient number who vote who are keeping them locked up.
Well said.
That's right.
Yeah, they are.
That's right. And we're sending back people into danger. You know, we've had Tamil refugees returned to Sri Lanka, and we know that they've been jailed and some of them have been tortured when we've got there. We've sent people back to Iran where they have been jailed, tortured and executed when they got there. We know that. We know people have gone back to Afghanistan and disappeared. So I think if you're white and European, where you might have a bit of a rough time in some ways, maybe not as much now, it's not half as much as if you're a brown refugee.
Well, we send Kiwis.
Yes, I accept that. I accept that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we send Kiwis home and they've got no life there. They were born in Australia.
So there are some things that haven't changed. There are some things that have changed. You're right, Piers. When European migrants arrived here after First World War II, they had a terrible time. And now people who arrive who are Muslims and brown and refugees are having a terrible time. It seems to move around groups. So it's unfortunate that we haven't actually learnt in 2,000 years and more, 2,500 years, not to act like this towards certain groups of people.
We have a town in Queensland that's petitioning the government and has been for 2 or 3 years to try and get a refugee family back who arrived here illegally.
Yeah, and that's the Billawheeler family. And the thing that bugs me about that is they've been found not to be refugees, yet the woman who fled saw her husband burnt alive to death with a number of his friends. How does this not make this woman in danger? How does this not say that she is in danger in her home country? I don't understand this at all, how the government can actually make that call. So, you know, this ongoing problem of nationalism and racism and sort of a prejudice towards the dominant, if you like, ethnic grouping is an ongoing issue in our world. And I mean, despite all its irony and its humour, because there is a lot of humour going on here, even in this chapter, because both Boaz and Ruth are acting over the top, if you want to put it that way. It has a very serious purpose at its heart. Any other comments and questions you want to make in the last couple of minutes, because we're almost out of time?
There are about the contradiction in this book, Elizabeth and John.
Sorry, what was that, Bill?
There's a sort of a contradiction here in that if on the one hand, this is a fable of the story with people with made up names to make some particular point, and on the other hand, it's a story which is embedded in the lineage of David.
Yeah.
So, which is it?
I would say it's a midrash, Bill. This is typical of midrash. We take a known fact, like there was a Moabite great-grandfather of David who married someone named Boaz in Bethlehem, and we know nothing about her, but we build a whole story around it. That's typical midrash. That's what's happened here.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Potiphar's wife, this is another example. If you all remember the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, and that's all we know about her. And then she cries foul and says he tried to rape me, and Joseph is jailed, and then he has the dream, etc., etc. The rabbis have created this entire history around Potiphar's wife. They gave her a name. They tried to think of her motivations and why she would seduce Joseph and why she would act the way she did. And they came up with the fact her husband wasn't interested in her, or he was a eunuch, and that she was a poor woman who was, you know, sexually frustrated, and that's why she was naturally attracted to Joseph. There's this whole backstory here that the rabbis supply. And there's all sorts of backstories to Moses too. When we look at when he dies, there's no information about that in our Bibles, but they produce this whole thing with Moses on his deathbed and what happens to him. So this is very, very typical of Midrash.
Yes, which just proves that shows the point of all of these stories. All of these books are so interesting in their own right, in the way they're written, the way they're composed, what they're about, and what their point was.
Yes, that's right. And, you know, you can make, because this is such an important issue and this woman is in David's lineage to actually make this point, you've got to construct a story to make the point. You just can't point at it and say, well, our genealogy says that David's great-grandmother was a Moabite. You know, constructing a story around that and using humour to actually sell it is a smart way to go, I think, if you're speaking into the equivalent of one nation in the ancient Israelite community, which is what's happening.
I ask a question, which was constructed first, the story about Ruth or the genealogy that we've been talking about?
It's quite possible that there was a genealogy in existence and the story of Ruth was constructed around it. I would be inclined to see the chronology in that way. But it is possible, of course, there was a story constructed about an unknown grandmother. All we've got is the name of Boaz. We have no idea who he married in the genealogy. So let's get him a Moabite wife and make a point.
Because it's important as far as the genealogy of Jesus as described by Matthew, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, which is a load of nonsense in a sense, but it also has a very significant point to it.
Yes, exactly. And the same here. This genealogy will prove that proves that Ruth is blessed by the God of Israel. You know, that she produces this child. So whenever anyone produces a male child, you know they're blessed by the God of Israel. That's how the Hebrew Bible works. So the genealogy is important, but this author has made it important in another way because he's challenging these national, or she, because I think a woman could have written this, he or she is challenging those nationalistic tendencies. This could have well been written by one of those divorced wives as a victim of this nationalistic policy. Who knows?
Oh, well, that makes sense. Now, all you've got to do is find the evidence for that, Elizabeth, and that'll be marvellous.
Yeah. All right, good people.
That's your next PhD thesis.
Yes.
No. It's time we end today. If you would like to stay for Lectionary Cafe, it will start at 12 o'clock.